Basically, we're on a path to bankruptcy. America's on a path to bankruptcy. We've got this massive federal bureaucracy. Government spending is like bankrupting the country. Our interest payments on the national debt now exceed the Defense Department budget. The Defense Department budget is like $1 trillion a year. 23% of all government income taxes, tariffs, and everything is just going to pay interest right now. And that number is continually rising. So if we don't do something, the entire government budget will be paying interest. There won't be money for anything.
I think it does seem like we're headed into a recession here. The magnitude of that recession is debatable, but I think it's at least a light to moderate recession. Potentially, it's on the order of 2009. So I think it's wise to kind of like prepare for the worst, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Don't get too adventurous. Like, watch out for margin debt. I really advise people to not have margin debt in a volatile stock market. And, from a cash standpoint, keep powder dry. You can get some pretty extreme things happening in a down market. Like Brett Johnson, who was the CFO of SpaceX, was at Broadcom in 2000. And he said that, and that's a good company making good products. And he said that from peak to trough, I think in less than 12 months, Broadcom went down 97%. So like, even if you had a small margin loan there, you got crushed. It subsequently recovered, and I think, to much higher levels. But, if there's like mass panic in the stock market, then you got to really be careful about margin debt. But I mean, this is just, as we know, the economy is cyclic and somewhat overdue for a recession. And my best guess is that, we have sort of stormy times for a year to a year and a half, and then things start to, dawn breaks. Recessions don't, like booms don't last forever, but neither do recessions.
And it's a 14-year boom. So a 6-quarter recession seems like that might actually balance out. The last time it was 4 or 5 quarters. So it's not easy.
America is also going bankrupt extremely quickly. Everyone seems to be sort of whistling past the graveyard on this one.
They're all grabbing the silverware. Everyone's stuffing their pockets with the silverware before this Titanic sinks.
The Defense Department budget is a very big budget. Okay, it's $1 trillion a year. D.O.G.E. Intel, it's $1 trillion. And interest payments on the national debt just exceeded the Defense Department budget. They're over $1 trillion a year, just in interest, and rising. We're adding $1 trillion to our debt, which our kids and grandkids are going to have to pay somehow every 3 months. And then soon it's going to be every 2 months, and then every month. And then the only thing we'll be able to pay is interest. It's just like a person at scale that has racked up too much credit card debt. And this does not have a good ending. We have to reduce the spending.
The counter argument I hear from a lot of politicians is, if we reduce spending, because right now if you add up federal, state, and local government spending, it's between 40 and 50% of GDP. So nearly half of our economy is supported by government spending, and nearly half of people in the United States are dependent directly or indirectly on government checks, either through contractors that the government pays or they're employed by a government entity. So if you go in and you take too hard an axe too fast, you will have significant contraction, job loss, and recession. What's the balancing act, Elon? Just thinking realistically, because I'm 100% on board with you. How do you really address it when so much of the economy and so many people's jobs and livelihoods are dependent on government spending?
Well, I do think it's sort of false dichotomy. It's not like no government spending is going to happen. You really have to say, is it the right level? And just remember that any given person, if they are doing things in a less efficient organization versus a more efficient organization, their contribution to the economy, their net output of goods and services will reduce. I mean, you've got a couple of clear examples between East Germany and West Germany, North Korea and South Korea. I mean, North Korea, they're starving. South Korea, it's like amazing.
The compounding effect of productivity gains. Yeah.
Yeah, it's night and day. And so in the North Korea, you've got 100% government. In South Korea, you've got probably, 40% government. It's not zero. Yeah. And yet you've got a standard of living that is probably 10 times higher in South Korea. At least, exactly. And then East and West Germany. In West Germany, you had, just thinking in terms of cars, I mean, you had BMW, Porsche, Audi, Mercedes. And East Germany, which is a random line on a map, the only car you could get was a Trabant, which is basically a lawnmower with a shell on it. And it was extremely unsafe. There was a 20-year wait. So you put your kid on the list as soon as they're conceived. And even then, only I think, a quarter of people maybe got this lousy car. That's just an interesting example of basically the same people, different operating system. And it's not like West Germany was some, a capitalist heaven. It's quite socialist, actually. So probably it was half government in West Germany and 100% government in East Germany. And again, it's sort of at least a 5 to 10x standard of living difference, and even qualitatively vastly better. It's obviously, sometimes people have these, amazingly in this modern era, this debate as to which system is better. Well, I'll tell you which system is better. The one that doesn't need to build the wall to keep people in. Okay, that's how you can tell. It's a dead giveaway. You have to build a barrier to keep people in. That is the bad system. It wasn't West Berlin that built the wall. Okay, they were like, anyone who wants to flee West Berlin, go ahead. And if you look at sort of the flux of boats from Cuba, there's a large number of boats from Cuba, and there's a bunch of free boats that anyone can take back to Cuba.
Yeah. Like, plenty of seats.
There's like, hey, wow, an abandoned boat. I could use this boat to go to Cuba where they have communism. Awesome. And yet nobody picks up those boats and does it. Amazing.
If we cut government spending in half, jobs will be created fast enough to make up for...
Obviously, I'm not suggesting that people had immediately, tossed out with no severance and, can't pay their mortgage. Then you see some reasonable off-ramp where they're still receiving money, but have a year or two to find jobs in the private sector, which they will find. And then they will be in a different operating system. And again, you can see the difference. East Germany was incorporated into West Germany. Living standards in East Germany rose dramatically. The sheer number of disgruntled workers, former government employees, is quite a scary number. I mean, I might not make it, The thing is that if it's not done, if you have a once-in-a-lifetime or once-in-a-generation opportunity and you don't take serious action, you have 4 years to get it done. And if it doesn't get done, then... I think actually the reality is that if we get rid of nonsense regulations and shift people from the government sector to the private sector, we will have immense prosperity. And I think we'll have a golden age in this country. And it'll be fantastic. The government is more competent than it is. I'm not saying that there aren't competent people in the government. They're just in an operating system that is inefficient. Once you move them to a more efficient operating system, their output is dramatically greater, as we've seen when East Germany was reintegrated with West Germany. And the same people were vastly more prosperous with a basically half-capitalist operating system. For a lot of people, their maybe most direct experience with the government is the DMV. And then the important thing to remember is that the government is the DMV at scale. How much do you want to scale it? It's been a long time since there was a serious effort to reduce the size of government and to remove absurd regulations. And, the last time there was a really concerted effort on that front was Reagan in the early 80s. So we're 40 years away from a serious effort to remove regulations that don't serve the greater good and reduce the size of government. And I think it's just, if we don't do that, then what's happening is that we get regulations and laws accumulating every year until eventually everything's illegal. And that's why we can't get major infrastructure projects done in the United States. Like if you look at the absurdity of the California high-speed rail, I think they spent $7 billion and have a 1,600-foot segment that doesn't actually have rail in it. I mean, your tax dollars at work, that's an expensive 1,600 feet of concrete, I realize sometimes I'm perhaps a little optimistic with schedules, but I wouldn't be doing the things I'm doing if I was, not an optimist. But at the current trend, California high-speed rail might finish sometime next century. Maybe. Well, probably not.
We'll have teleportation by that time. So.
Yeah, exactly. AI do everything at that point. I think you really think of the United States and many countries, it's arguably worse than the EU, as being like Gulliver tied down by a million little strings. And like any one given regulation is not that bad, but you've got a million of them, or millions actually. And then eventually you just can't get anything done. This is a massive tax on the consumer, on the people. It's just they don't realize that there's this massive tax in the form of irrational regulation. I'll give you a recent example that is just insane, is that SpaceX was fined by the EPA $140,000 for, they claimed, dumping potable water on the ground, drinking water. And we're like, this is at Starbase. And we're like, we're in a tropical thunderstorm region. That stuff comes from the sky all the time. And there was no actual harm done. It was just water to cool the launch pad during liftoff. There's zero harm done. They agree, yes, there's zero harm done. We're like, okay, so there's no harm done, but you want us to pay a $140,000 fine? It's like, yes, because you didn't have a permit. Okay. We didn't know there was a permit needed for zero harm fresh water being on the ground in a place where fresh water falls from the sky all the time, next to the ocean. Sometimes it rains so much, the roads are flooded. So we're like, how does this make any sense? They were like, well, we're not going to process any more of your applications for launch, for Starship launch, unless you pay this $140,000. They just ransomed us. And we're like, okay, so we paid $140,000. But it's like, this is no good. At this rate, we're never going to get to Mars. The sensible deregulation and reduction in the size of government is just like be very public about it and say like, which of these rules, if the public is really excited about a rule and wants to keep it, we'll just keep it. And here's the thing about the rules. If the rule is, turns out to be a bad, we'll just put it right back. And then, problem solved. It's like, it's easy to add rules, but we don't actually have a process for getting rid of them. That's the issue. There's no garbage collection for rules.
Interest rates have been rising. That increased the cost to the consumer of getting loans, things like that. We've had a stock market correction, really a crash in a lot of growth stocks, software stocks. From where you sit and the data that you see, where do you think the economy is headed right now? Do you think we're in a recession, or is it just a risk? How do you assess our current economic situation?
Well, predicting macroeconomics is always difficult, and one should assign probabilities to these things. Now, the thing is that recessions are not necessarily a bad thing. I've now been through a few of them, and what tends to happen is if you have a boom that goes on for too long, you get misallocation of capital. It starts raining money on fools, basically. It's like any dumb thing gets money, and I'm sure you've seen a few of those. So at some point it gets just out of control, and you just have a misallocation of human capital where people are doing things that are silly and not useful to their fellow human beings. And then those companies, there needs to be sort of an economic enema, if you will, to have everyone sort of shift uncomfortably in their seats. But eventually the economic enema does its job. It clears out the pipes, if you will.
Yes.
And sort of the bullshit companies go bankrupt, and the ones that are doing useful products are prosperous. And but there's certainly a lesson here that if one is making useful product and has a company that makes sense, make sure you're not running things too close to the edge from a capital standpoint, that you've got some capital reserves to last through irrational times. Because in the past, when there's been a recession, it has gone, it's amazing, it's flipped like a light switch. I mean, David, do you remember this when from the PayPal, ex-PayPal days, when we raised $100 million in March of 2000, and we had, the demand was so high, we had people like VCs, like just literally without even a term sheet, wiring money into our account. They literally would like sleuth out our bank account number and wire money in. And we're like, where'd this come from? And it's like, oh. So it was like, there was literally fire hosing money in March of 2000. And then in April 2000, the market went into free fall, and it went from raising money was trivial to even good companies could not raise money in a month. So it's just important to bear in mind like that, PayPal almost went bankrupt in 2000. We came close, but thankfully we'd raised that $100 million in March 2000, without which we would be in game over, basically. And we kind of saw it coming. So it's like we got the X Confinity merger done in like 3 weeks and raised $100 million. Because we were all like, we see this coming to an end pretty soon. And then a month later, it was like, a nightmare, basically. And make sure if you're a healthy company, you got some capital to get through things. And then what's your costs? And if it is a recession, which more likely than not, it is a recession. I'm not saying it is, but it probably is. Then just watch your cash flow and get to positive cash flow as soon as you can. So I think we probably are in a recession, and that recession will get worse. But these things pass, and then there will be boom times again. So it'll probably be some tough going for, I don't know, a year. Maybe 12 to 18 months is usually the amount of time that it takes for a correction to happen. The federal budget deficit is insane. It's like $3 trillion federal expenditures are $7 trillion, federal revenue is $4 trillion. That's a $3 trillion difference if this was a company, it'd be a $3 trillion loss. So I don't know if we should be adding to that loss. That seems pretty crazy. Something's got to give. You can't just spend $3 trillion more than you earn every year and don't expect something bad to happen. I think, this is not good. The deficit is more than $3 trillion when you look at the future obligations. So it's $7 trillion of current expenditures, but it's much more than that if you look at future obligations for Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. So we're running this incredible deficit. Something's got to give. I don't know. This can't keep going. The obvious reason for inflation is that the government printed a zillion amount of more money than it had, obviously. It's like the government can't just, have issue checks far in excess of revenue without there being inflation, velocity of money held constant. So unless there's something would change with velocity of money, but if the federal government writes checks, they never bounce. So that is effectively creation of more dollars. And if there are more dollars created, then the increase in the goods and services output of the economy, then you have inflation. Again, velocity of money held constant. But this is very basic. This is not like, super complicated. And if the government could just issue massive amounts of money and deficits didn't matter, then why don't we just make the deficit 100 times bigger? Okay. And the answer is you can't, because it will basically turn the dollar into something that is worthless. And various countries have tried this experiment multiple times. It's not like, oh, I wonder what happens if this is done.
Yeah.
Have you seen Venezuela? Like the poor people of Venezuela have been just run roughshod by their government. And so obviously you can't simply create money. The true economy is very important. Like the true economy is the output of goods and services. It's not money. It's literally, what is the output of goods and services? Money is simply a way for us to, or anything that you call money, is a way for us to conveniently exchange goods and services without having to engage in barter, and also to shift obligations in time. Those are the two reasons that you have money, this thing called money. It's really it's a database. Money is an information system for labor allocation and for exchange of goods and services and for translating in time. And the quality of that information is a function of, it's like you can apply information theory to money. And I think it helps explain why one money system is, or why one action is better than another. And so just like an internet connection, you'd want something that's high bandwidth, low latency and jitter, and is not dropping packets, does not have a lot of errors in the system. And the same is true of money. And really, like you said, what did PayPal really do? That it helped improve the bandwidth, the speed at which money could move. Instead of mailing checks back and forth, which amazingly, that was what people did in 2000, you could now do real-time exchange of money, and now you could ship your goods immediately instead of mailing a check and waiting for the bank to clear the check. So the ultimate thing that with PayPal, if it sort of was in the X.com, less sort of niche payments, more sort of broad financial, would be to simply disintermediate all the heterogeneous COBOL databases out there running on mainframes doing batch processing, and have a single real-time system that was secure and not batch processing. So it would just be, from an information standpoint, more efficient. And eventually all the batch processing COBOL mainframes operated by the banks would cease to exist. I sure hope we don't need a war. There will be certainly, an economic competition that I think will blow people away when they realize just how competitive they have to be competitive with companies in China. It's very difficult. Tesla is competitive because we have an awesome team in China. Tesla is sort of pretty far out there in terms of work ethic anywhere in the world. So the Tesla work ethic in the US, I think, is substantially greater than any other car company or any large manufacturing company that I'm aware of. Look, I think the point of a company is to produce useful products and services for your fellow human beings. It is not, some political gathering place or a thing where that's the point of a company. I'd say it's, politics and other stuff should let's not lose sight of why companies should exist.
I have been guiding our portfolio company CEOs to be at cash flow break even now or extend runway to Q1 2025. Well, Elon and I are kind of roughly in the same place we have been for a while, which is like you need to give yourself 2 to 3 quarters of buffer so that you can go and raise a round, which takes 1/4 to 2 quarters. And once you start to get escape velocity out of a recession, having money through end of Q1 2025, I think, is a minimum requirement. And of the companies that I think were the most precariously positioned, there was 5 of them that got their acts together and really did it. But these are all CEOs of companies that, if I said them, you would know some of them.
Yeah, I said Stan Druckenmiller. He, as you recall, he predicted that inflation would be lasting. This was in the spring of 2021 when transitory was the word of the day. This year, he predicted the bear market rally we had in July and August. And I remember back at the Coatue Summit in May, or around that time, he was interviewed and he basically was saying that as soon as there was a bear market rally over the summer, that he would then put a short position on. I don't know if he actually did that, but he said he was going to do that. And then it turns out that the summer rally that we had was a dead cat bounce. So he was right about that. And now he is predicting a hard landing with a deeper recession than many expect. So sadly, I suspect he may be right yet again.
Friedberg, best investor for you.
I had Druckenmiller. I indicated that he's been doing interviews pretty much every quarter for the last 2 years, and he's been pounding the table, telling everyone what's going to happen, and it all happened. And he even told people the trades. He said he was short long-dated treasuries, and he was long commodities. And if you had put those 2 trades on at that time and held them to today, you would have made a fortune. And so I think he's extraordinary in his ability to kind of see macro in a way that others don't, but also to take extremely brave action with his portfolio. He's renowned for how big the bets are that he makes and how quickly he can change his mind when he's wrong. and make another big bet and still get himself out of the hole. He's incredible. So I definitely give it to Stanley Druckenmiller this year.
On a dollar basis, the biggest business loser was big tech. And I think that you saw three things happen, which I think are important for the future. The first was it was the most crowded trade, both by professional money managers as well as retail. And that fever finally broke. You're seeing a lot of panicked selling to cover losses and other things. So I think that number one, that happened. Number two, regulators basically said, we're going to go after these guys every single which way we can. And then number three, I think it started to change the innovation cycle where people now actually believe that they can't outspend because folks won't tolerate it. And the things that they're spending their money on seem kind of foolish.
The Fed trying to play catch up is the worst trend for me, oversteering into the crash.
We have record deficits, record debt, adding another $1.65 trillion of spending that nobody can seemingly account for. We have not gotten religion yet around being measured in how we spend money.
The government colluding with big tech to engage in censorship. This is how they're going to do the authoritarianism. We talked about it with Schellenberger and Elon, this whole series of revelations known as the Twitter files. We can see this collusion, this cozy relationship between the censors at Twitter and big tech and the bureaucrats at the FBI and DHS and Pentagon. This is a really disturbing dystopian relationship, as we talked about it earlier. And, I feel like we spend all this time talking about the authoritarianism in Russia and China. We seem to be obsessed with combating that and going to war with that. But we don't spend enough time talking about this growing authoritarianism at home. The media doesn't seem to want to report on the Twitter files at all. Let's focus on stopping authoritarianism here.
My worst trend is what I would call interest rate mania. And I think that this is the mania that we've been caught up in on this show, that other people on our thread, people in the business community and the investing community, where everyone's obsession with did the Fed act soon enough or late enough, and that interest rates ultimately drive success or failure with building businesses and making good investments.
All right,
and the truth is, when interest rates go the wrong way, good investments can kind of strengthen their way, can make their way through those environments. Bad investments cannot. Good businesses can make their way through and bad investments cannot. And so I think our mania around the fact that interest rates and the Fed ultimately drove bad outcomes in businesses and investments is a flawed kind of assertion. And we all want to kind of get back to the drunken days where, a low interest rate environment enables us all to be successful and wealthy. And I think that that's kind of changed. So I think it's time for us to get away from the interest rate mania and focus more on solid investing and solid business.